how many of you today live in a city? How many of you have ever been to a city? Okay, good. I like to make sure I'm covering, a broad waterfront. So with my company, Charette, we get to focus on a lot of what we think of as wicked problems, big, complex problems that are sort of interrelated with a variety of different issues, and we've been able to focus on things like the future of higher education. I'll be doing a session tomorrow on the future of work, and what we've increasingly focused our efforts on is thinking a lot about the future of the city, because there are a variety of really, really complicated issues that are associated with cities, and that's what makes them so fascinating. So I'm just going to blast through a couple of different perceptions, lenses, filters about how people think about cities, about these big, complex animals with lots of moving parts. And then I'm going to bring up some panels to help us sort of deconstruct some of the ways that we can think about how do cities go exponential. So what you've heard a lot about in the past two days is about exponential change. And so there's a research group that has coined the phrase the Great Acceleration. And so what you'll find if you just Google that phrase is that there's a tremendous number of trends that over the past 150 years have all accelerated, all gone exponential. It's not just Moore's law, everything related to energy, population, and so on. And especially when it comes to urban population, this is the true Great Accelerator. So as Salim said, we've actually passed over the point where more than 50% of all people in the world actually live in a city, and all that's going to happen is that's going to continue to accelerate. Urban areas, the number of people in urban areas flatlines, but the number of people in cities accelerates to the point where it's projected by 2050 easily 70 to 75% of all people on this planet. Another 2.8 billion people will be living inside of cities. That's an incredible set of issues to be able to, that we're going to have to deal with. And so I've coined the phrase Homo urbanus. If you can picture, from the, crawling out of the water to becoming the erect man. Now there's somebody walking around with a GPS, getting around inside a city. That's what's happened. That's the arc that we've followed. But it's important to understand, well, what is a city? What are the different pieces? What are the different lenses that we use to think about a city? So there's all sorts of different metaphors that people use. So for instance, some think of it just as simply as a larger village. Cities grew, if you look at the history of Rome, it actually grew from a very, very tiny town. So the village, the whole metaphor of thinking about all the different pieces of a village and just something that's scaled is one way of looking at a city. Another is the mentality that the city is actually a machine. There's a lot of different moving parts, and then we can actually mechanistically deconstruct the city. We can think about it as a machine that can be optimized. That's another perspective. So each of you, I'm sure, has your own lens, your own preference of one of these filters. The city that you're in right now, San Francisco, is comprised of a tremendous number of neighborhoods. And as a matter of fact, these aren't static. There's always, I've lived in the city since I was 9 years old. And there's always a new name for some area that I didn't even know had its own identity because it's a living, breathing thing. Increasingly, there's a mentality, this sort of top-down sort of view, that the city is a platform. That is, there are companies, this is actually a study, if you Google this, it's done by the World Economic Forum, but the city is a platform. There are companies like IBM and Oracle that have basically deconstructed the different components of a city and said, well, we can kind of manage these things just like you manage a big corporation. You can deconstruct all the different pieces, have software running them, and you can have this sort of top-down approach. And as you'll see as we talk to some of our panelists, there's top-down and there's bottom-up. And it turns out because of the complexity of a city, we actually need to approach them from both ways. Some people think of the city as an ecosystem. So if you want to carry the metaphor, those of us who were up in the cityscape room last night, that's the top of the canopy. But here we are down, we're closer to the ground, so this is where our alpha predators like us belong. But cities look like ecosystems as well. They're a variety of complex, interrelated parts, but they all are living and breathing and interacting in a variety of complex ways. And so increasingly, this metaphor is being used to help city planners to be able to start to think about all the different elements of a city, how they can organically grow in parallel and in interaction with each other, as opposed to just being managed from the top down. This is actually a picture of a social network. And so one of the things that we don't have today that we have for our online social media that helps us to understand the way that our networks interact, we don't have this kind of view of the way that people in cities interact. Another view is as a nation state. So one of the memes that we find is increasingly being discussed by people is that the city is one of the last true functioning seats of government. That is that at the federal level, certainly in our country, you might have heard that it's a rather polarizing election and a rather polarizing set of terms about how people think about whether it's a scarcity or an abundance period. Increasingly, the perception is that the city has to be that functioning seat of government because it must be relevant to people locally. So Parag Khanna is a good friend of mine. A great book to look at is called Connectography. And what Parag talks about is that actually cities can be defined by flows. That is, you see this tremendous interaction between cities, these corridors where data and commerce flow, much like the old trade routes did back around the era of the Silk Road, for example. And so you'll see that there's actually these flows, digital flows between cities that are defining them more as nation states, that is, as their own economies. And there's increasing work to try to figure out ways for us to be able to link cities together. City is also a platform for innovation. And so I'm going to bring up Dale Doherty from Maker Media to talk about, well, how do you do that from the bottoms up? How do you create these innovative spaces? And how do you try to encourage entrepreneurism inside a city? And then increasingly, because of so many of the challenges that we're having with cities, the city is actually, we have to think of it as something that is a resilient fabric. That is, this is an initiative started by the Rockefeller Foundation to try to help people to understand, well, what is it that keeps a city being able to be adaptive and allowing its citizens to thrive? So the truth is that all of these are true. They're all accurate. So I encourage you to Google this and see each of the different elements, but this is one way to try to think of all the different pieces of a city. So it talks about a seaport, an airport, high schools, middle schools, corner grocery stores, and it talks about how the mixing and matching of these things dynamically is a way to think about the way that the building blocks of cities can actually be interactively combined to be able to create thriving communities. But basically you can try to break down cities in a variety of different functions. One way to think about it is sort of these three big bins: economic, social, and political. And so increasingly what you find is that the city is the flashpoint for the way that we interact as human beings. These are all the different issues that we're all trying to collaborate on. And unfortunately, because of that complexity, not just Houston, but virtually every major city has a set of consistent problems. So one example is that it turns out as we look to the impact of global climate change, the city is actually the seat of the problem. That is, because we have aggregated so tightly, so densely, as opposed to being more distributed, we've concentrated energy, and therefore we also concentrated carbon dioxide emissions. And so some of the things that Brad was talking about in terms of the opportunities to be able to change the way that we design our cities so that we can factor for some of these problems is critical. But it's not just, obviously, just carbon dioxide emissions. These are from the headlines that Peter Diamandis doesn't read in his newspaper, so which I admit I do. So the truth is there's a wide variety of problems. That's why we call these wicked challenges, because there's lots of different interacting issues, and they're all complicated, and they all are not simple to be able to deconstruct. Take homelessness, for example. It's not monolithic. It's actually a range of different behaviors and issues, and yet we put one tag on it and we say, that's this big wicked problem that makes it very, very difficult to deconstruct and solve. So the truth is that the city is the flashpoint for where we actually can solve some of these issues dynamically in terms of building the kinds of connective tissues. So I think of this as the opportunity for an exponential city. So what are some of the characteristics of an exponential city? How do we have to think about it? So as I mentioned, my group, we've had the excitement of being able to focus on a wide variety of wicked problems. And back in the early 2000s, we were focused on what we called social capital. That is, how do you accelerate the flow of capital to good? And we realized that there were probably half a dozen different things you wish would be in the world if you could wave your magic wand and have that arena have the impact that you want. And so in that particular arena, that is helping to accelerate the flow of capital to good, having more businesses that have a purpose and are focused on trying to do good in the world, you needed better entrepreneurs. You needed there to be businesses that actually could be seen as poster children. You needed something like a B Corp, benefit corp, that would have a new way to be able to structure a corporation, different kinds of capital that could support those corporations, and finally different ways that capital could partner. And so we didn't claim, we started an event called SOCAP, Social Capital Markets, and we didn't claim with that event to have changed the world or have made any of these things happen. What we tried to do is help to create the conditions under which they could. And so when I pull the panelists up here, I'm actually going to ask them to answer questions along the lines of, well, what would be needed to create an exponential city? How do we do that? We had all these different lenses, all these different ways of looking at how we can potentially transform our cities. And I'm going to throw some of these out as just sort of starters. So obviously, we need to understand all of the issues that are going on in a city if we want to be able to impact them. And so there's a tremendous number of initiatives right now that are trying to basically unpack the data, build open data platforms, and allow people to build applications on top of those open data platforms so that we have greater awareness of what's going on inside our cities. We need to engage citizens. We need to be able to figure out how we can more equitably distribute the resources in a city. And we have to balance the issues, not just between top-down and bottom-up, between long and short-term planning. Because the truth is, so many of the changes you've been hearing about at this event, so many of the opportunities to be able to make these changes are where people go sort of out of band. They go and they innovate in a new space, as John Hagel was saying, on the edge. But cities are basically, the definition of them is their history. There's the fossil layer that has defined all the different pieces of a city from its past and going in the future, and making major physical changes can be really, really difficult. So you must think of ways to be able to balance both of these, long and short. So we don't just have problems, we've got lots of solutions. Let me give you two examples of mentalities, and then we'll pull our panelists up here. So the first is there's one called Fab City, which is an attempt to link together a dozen different cities around the world who all basically make the same commitment to being both globally connected, that is sharing best practices between themselves, but also being locally self-sufficient. That is doing all the things that are necessary to be able to build off of the local capabilities to be able to make sure that they can be sustained and thrived. There's another one that actually my organization is helping with called Quantified Planet, which is supported by the Swedish government. And this is an attempt to be able to pull data from a variety of different sources and make that a living, breathing process by which we can know about our personal health, know about the health of cities, and know about the health of our environment. So I want to point out two, so that's the sort of top-down. There's two bottoms-up examples I want to give. One is right here in San Francisco, there's a marvelous woman named Jen Palka who started something called Code for America. What they do is they bring entrepreneurs from around the country into small teams, SWAT teams, to focus on specific problems for individual cities. So they've done incredible applications that have done unlocked value within cities, helped citizens to have access to resources and services that they never had easy access to before. I mean, here's another example that I like that's just completely innovation on the edge. So in Australia, there was a new census website that the Australian government had paid $10 million to build, and when they went to turn it on, it wouldn't go on. It just plain didn't work. So at a hackathon over a weekend, 2 students knocked together a site for about $500 and turned it on the following Monday, and it worked. So this is one of the opportunities within cities to be able to take these kinds of amazing capabilities and to be able to put entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial action into making these changes. All right, so let's get exponential. Let me pull up my panelists.